Wonderful. I'd like to welcome you all for our artist talk today. My name is Dr. August Jordan Davis. I have the privilege to serve as the department chair for the Department of Art and Art History, as well as director of the gallery here at UTA. The exhibition that you are sitting within right now, called Paper Trails, represents about 2 years of work that we've done to identify and bring together these particular artists and artworks, which intersect and diverge around how we relate to the printed matter. What is our relationship to paper and to books? How do we metabolize those creatively in contemporary art? This is the work of 3 individual artists across 2 large generations. We've got a big age gap between our artists here, but each of them are responding over the last few years in really meditative ways about how we navigate our wonderfully full world of visual culture and its printed materials. What do we do with all of the mail, the direct marketing that comes to our house? You know, we're constantly trying to recycle and be conscientious about these unwanted catalogs that come unsolicited in the post. Well, can those become almost wonderfully archaeological finds? Can they transmorph into sculptural works? Can we have a really fun and postmodern relationship to how we look at antiquity in printed matter and how we think about that in relationship to popular culture and our print media culture? What are the different ways in which we can look at the printed work as something that we're actively engaged in making, and how do we bring together all of these different components of collage, of utilizing appropriated found materials, making, Japanese marbled print papers, doing lots of wonderful things with appropriated photographic images like we see in Cecilia's work, utilizing her own original photography as well within some of those images. So we've tried to bring together all of these different components of these practices that help you look at these really novel ways of engaging with a particular starting point to have really resplendent results in very different directions in terms of the kinds of artworks and materials that result from that process. So for instance, you'll see Jessica will talk a bit about these amazing interventions with old books that she has made. We're really fortunate to have her here today to bring us into this exhibition at its opening day with a talk about her contributions and the artworks that we've selected from her. So in just a moment, I'm going to hand over to Jessica to have her present to us a wonderful set of insights about the work that she has made and that she's very graciously loaned us for this exhibition. And so before I do that, I just want to make a few announcements, which is, first of all, the show officially opens today, and we celebrate that opening with a reception this evening. And the reception begins at 5:30 here in the gallery. We will have refreshments. All of our artists will be here, so if you have questions, bring them. They'll be happy to hear about them. That runs until 8 p.m. tonight. Our other 2 artists will be in conversation with us on September the 26th. So we hope that you'll join us again at 12:30 to 1:30 for that in conversation with Cecilia and Rachel that I'll be moderating on September the 26th. And tell all of your friends and family about the show. It is open until October the 5th, Mondays through Saturdays. We are open. We're really excited to have all kinds of visitors come and enjoy this work. We've really tried to be mindful of our students as we curated the show to think about ways in which this will enrich your own creative practice. So, without further ado, let me welcome and thank Jessica Drenk for joining us today. Jessica is an American artist who was raised in Montana, whose artworks are in collections and galleries around the world. They're held in corporate collections. They're held at university collections, including the Yale University Art Gallery has works by Jessica in their permanent collection. She's been the recipient of several awards, including International Sculpture Center's Outstanding Student Achievement in Contemporary Sculpture and her work has been pictured in sculpture and interior design magazines, as well as in the Workshop Guide to Ceramics. Jessica received her MFA in 3D art from the University of Arizona in 2007, and previously she had acquired her bachelor's degree from Pomona College in 2002. We're really excited to have been able to bring Jessica to join us here for the talk today. Jessica is based in Rochester, New York, and that is where she lives and works and has a really beautiful studio where all of these wonderful pieces originate. She is represented by Gallery Urbane here in Dallas, and that's how we first got to meet Jessica, and so we're really pleased to welcome her, and I'd like you to all show her a very great Texan howdy.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Or howdy, or what? Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to speak with you all. I have prepared a talk about my work that is sort of in 3 parts, and I hope that one of those parts will be of interest to everybody. First, I'm going to sort of do the more academic, the basis for my artwork, the concepts that are involved, how my work emerged from when I was an undergraduate to now. Then I'm going to change gears for a little bit and talk about, because I'm a full-time working artist, I make my living making and selling my artwork. I thought it might be interesting for students to understand how I transitioned from more academic work into work that is sold in galleries, and so I've got a sort of section where I talk about that a little bit. And then finally, I just wanted to speak to the creative process and creativity and places where that comes out in my work, and so that's the talk. So I just want to start from the very beginning. This is my, the other way. There we go, thank you. This is my senior thesis show at Pomona College in Claremont, California. It was in 2002, and fortunately there were only 3 art majors in my graduating class, and so I got a huge space in the gallery to present my senior show. And so I made this huge table. It's like 35 feet long, and I had these objects that were hanging in the gallery as well. And I just filled it with the material experiments that I was working on at that time. And the whole idea was that you could come and you could kind of see inside my brain and see what I was playing around with at that moment. The materials were pretty simple, and in my work, they still are really, but it was sort of like cheap things and whatever a student could find. I got plaster and wood screws and gesso from the art studios, and like fabric and books from thrift stores, wax and thread from craft stores, and like there's even some sticks and twigs that I just found on campus. I was just like looking for any kind of material that I could find and trying to figure out ways that I could like make sculptural textures and textures out of it. So the whole idea was just to like gather things that I could manipulate and combine to make interesting textures and forms. Most of what I did was simple and didn't take that much time, like taking a segment of a book. I'll be more obvious about this. Sorry, we're having a little, next slide, please. So like taking a segment of a book, puncturing it with screws, and then dipping it in water. That's on the left. Some of the experiments were simple, but yielded unexpected results, like the piece on the right, which was made in 3 steps. I took a section of book and I put it into a container with hot wax, letting it cool, and then slicing it in half with a handsaw, which is a really simple process, but I loved how when I sliced it in half, it looked more like a fossil than a book. And that was one of those like, wow, this is really cool. I've got to follow this and see where this leads. Another simple process I discovered was soaking books in water and reforming them. This paperback was bound with string while wet and then retained a beautiful shape when dry. And you can see examples of this technique over here on this shelf. These are all sort of from that era and came from this first experimentation of just like wetting books and then twisting them and letting them dry in new shapes. Some of the experiments were singular, like the book on the left, which is combined with wax and bubble wrap. Some of the experiments, like the singed, waxed, and sliced toilet paper roll on the right, led me to a whole series of work later on. Eventually, I started to fixate on books as an art material. I tried many different combinations of tearing them, gluing them, cutting the paper to create textures that ranged from pretty to gnarly. I found that I was fascinated by removing the function of the book as something that you can read and instead turning it into something that you're there to view. So here, one of the things that really interested me was I tore all the pages out of this book, leaving these text lines that line up on each page. So now you can't read the book, but you still have the sense of all the written material that was inside of it. And I like that sort of obscuring of the meaning. I find this to be beautiful and poignant at the same time. This is a similar book, torn down to the spine, that I just placed in a plastic bag with hot wax. This is the kind of piece that would really keep me going in my experimentations because I just never quite knew what to expect from some things and they'd turn out really surprising. Over time, I've learned to be much better at guessing what materials will do or how they might react to certain processes, and that all just comes from a lot of this early work just trying things out. When I arrived at graduate school, I began to see that there were some themes developing in my material experiments, and I began to group them into collections. This is the first incarnation of a collection and the installation that I built to house that collection. The idea for this display came from visits to natural history museums. I've always loved the experience you get in certain museums when you enter a dark room and there are like precious and significant specimens glowing under a light. There's like an aspect of theater and drama to it, and the museums are really good at directing your attention and getting you to come closer and look closely at a mineral or a fossil or a relic or an artifact. And these techniques of display really tell you that something is precious and important and meaningful. So of course I used them and played with them a little bit. I played with that technique too and undermined it a little bit by placing many objects together, none of which are more or less important than the other. So it's not like one singular thing to look at. And when you came close and really looked at them, you might start to make out something that's familiar and not at all precious, such as coffee filters. Here we get the next one. Coffee filters, which is the tall thing kind of near the middle, paper towels, which are to the left next to that, napkins, and other disposable everyday objects of the present. And I called this installation prehistorization because it seemed to sort of play with the concept of time. You expected to see something old, and instead you're looking at something that's very present day. And instead of an artifact from another culture or civilization, you're looking at the most mundane pieces of our own culture. Okay. Such as plastic. This is a stack of plastic soft drink lids that I poured hot wax over, like the things that you put the straws in. I just poured hot wax over them, and there was some air trapped between some of the lids that caused one side of the stack to rise in the hot wax. And then when I sliced through it with a saw, it looked like a fossilized nautilus shell. It was another one of those like wonderful, happy accidents, but amazing that something so it's just the opposite of what we encounter that object as usually in life. I continued to explore these themes in my master's thesis exhibition, where I turned a room of the art museum into a space that I called Archaeologica. The objects on display were once again the objects on display were once again made from everyday and man-made materials, and the displays themselves were all museum-like, but gone awry. Such as this pedestal and vitrine, which displayed toilet paper as if it was a precious relic. And then when you looked at it from the side, it was disconcertingly attached to the back of the glass case, so it's all out of place. It doesn't quite make sense. There were objects to be seen through little viewing windows, with one object in the bottom window 2 feet further back than those at the other windows. One window contained a whole environment created from toothpicks, and when you looked into it, it was like looking into a spiky little diorama or something like that. Everything was presented as if it made sense, but then it didn't, such as this mass of coffee filters bursting out of the end of its display case. It's like the objects are taking over the museum a little bit. While I was studying the language of museum displays and fossilizing a lot of everyday objects in wax, I was also playing with other techniques to turn man-made objects into pieces that had a sense of the natural world. The porcelain skins collection comes from the same ideas, but comes at them through a completely different technique. I had learned in ceramics classes about something called a burnout technique. This is where artists had used this previously by dipping fabric and other absorbent materials in ceramic slip, which you may know is like clay, but it's more liquid, so it's more like a cake batter consistency. So and then you dip an object that's absorbent, and then you fire it in the kiln, and when you fire it in the kiln, like whatever, the fabric burns away, and it just leaves this like skin of what you dipped. So I used this to dip things like Q-tips into the porcelain slip and then burn them away. With this piece, I think I only dipped the cotton ends of a group, like a cluster of Q-tips, and there must have been something in the cardboard sticks of the Q-tips because they left a little residue when burning up all those little sort of yellow-orangey bits. So that was another happy accident that adds to the organic nature of the piece. Here are coffee filters that are dipped in the same slip. In places where the porcelain slip only coats the coffee filter, it becomes like incredibly thin, like a very brittle shell or a calcified skin. And I just love how this technique takes soft, absorbent materials. Like here, this was a sleeve of round cotton cosmetic pads, and dipped in the slip and burned away. And through that process, they become shapes that look more like the calcified remains of bizarre animals or something like that, not something you would want to wipe your skin with. Meanwhile, I had not forgotten about books, which are my favorite material. The thing that had initially drawn me to altering books was that I love how malleable they are. Like you can tear them and cut them and glue them and wet them and wax them and do that all in different combinations. And in terms of my experimental process, they're really fertile material for me. I've often felt there's no end of what one could do with books. So this is an example of many different kinds of things. But even if I'm freezing them in wax, the same technique as I've used with coffee filters and toilet paper, the collection of objects that I make out of books feels different because books mean something different to us. Books are culturally important to us as a means of passing on ideas and stories, and they're how we keep a record of ourselves. By twisting and altering them, I often feel like I'm creating a fossil record of humanity. Something cerebral begins to feel corporeal, and the books themselves feel like extensions of our bodies as well as of our intellect. In altering books, I don't generally seize upon the content of that particular book, but rather see it as a symbol of ourselves, like a cultural artifact. And often the book is completely illegible, so it just symbolizes the idea of a book. and we each map our own associations and meanings onto that symbol. By the way, this is a book that I put sticks in between the pages and then hardened it with wax and sliced through them. In 2005, I was awarded a commission for a public sculpture at the University of Arizona. And instead of creating a large outdoor piece, I made over 100 small altered book pieces that are displayed in the front windows of the university library. I titled the collection of pieces, Reading Our Remains. Reading was a hint as to what the pieces were made of, and the remains refers to the forms the pieces took. For this work, I was the creator and then the curator. I selected only pieces that reminded me of natural history specimens or objects that were very old and eroded. They often had a sense of something left behind. Over the year the piece was on display, I would often walk by the library and see people looking at the work and realizing what it was. My favorite time, I walked by the library on my way to classes a lot, and one time I saw two women bending over the case, and I could just see through the window that one of them was saying, "It's books." That just made my day. So people would come to the library for the books and then seeing an exhibit that looked something like it was put up by the geology or the biology departments, only to then see that it was, in fact, books. So this is something I'm often striving to achieve in my work, which is that from afar it looks like something, and then up close you get to see the material is not exactly what you expected, or it's like the opposite of what you expected. Reading Our Remains presented a collection of books as relics from our past rather than pieces of the present. At that time, it was really clear that digitization of information was going to change our relationship with the printed word. It hadn't fully transformed yet, and it seemed like perhaps even paper books were going to become obsolete. So it felt really strange and fitting to be housed in the library. And today I enjoy the irony that a large portion of this installation ran through the reference section of the library, which had all the dictionaries and all the encyclopedias, and they're probably all obsolete at this point. I don't even know if there are reference sections in libraries anymore. I've thought a lot about books and what books mean to us and what they'll mean to us in the future. And at some point I started hardening whole books by soaking them in hot wax, which soaks into the pages and turns the book into a solid block when cooled. Then I carved the book with a wood carving gouge, and so that's how something like this is made. And I just find it amazing how much like wood the books become when soaked in this wax. I guess it makes sense because they're made of wood pulp, but it's still kind of amazing and surprising that it really does look like a wood block, and it feels like a block of wood too. One of the funny things about these pieces is how quickly their meaning is changing because our relationship to books is changing. 20 years ago, some people would get upset because I was destroying books, and this was a bad thing. And I haven't heard anything like that in years, and instead, at this point, people are often delighted when I can turn outdated books into art. So now it feels more like I'm preserving the book, making it something you'd want to keep. The creative process is unpredictable. While I was carving those books that you just saw into those forms, I became really fascinated by the small shavings that I was carving off of the larger piece. And I started collecting those small little shavings, and it felt like they could become something. They have such a beauty to them. And it really felt like they needed to be collected and maybe pinned down like they were part of an insect collection or something like that. It took me several years of thinking about it and trying different formats before I arrived at the best way to collect them into a group that felt like a singular piece. And that's this oval, which really works to contain them as a collection and also reflects the shapes of many of the carvings. They're often ovals. So as I install this piece, pinning the carving shards directly to the wall, I group them together by size and shape and color, and they have kind of like a visual flow to them. It's almost like I'm creating my own classification system and sorting them accordingly as I put the piece on the wall. The piece usually takes people a while before they realize that it's printed word. This is one where you really have to get close and look at it. The text can only be seen in a few places, and it's really fun to watch people see this piece for the first time and try and figure out, like, what is it? Is it feathers? Is it shells? Is it little pieces of printed wood? It's a really, really fun one. And I called the series of work Bibliophilum, which is just a name that I made up, but it felt right for the material of the piece and the sort of idea of like collecting and classifying. Bibliophilum changed the way I work with books, moving from those like small little book-sized objects to a much larger wall sculpture. And after that piece, I began to create sculptures for the wall more and more. Cerebral mapping, which is what you see on the wall here too, is a series that takes books apart, reforms them, and puts them back together again. I cut the books into thin strips, and then I wet them and tangle them together. There are several layers, and up close you can read random snippets of the text from the variety of books that I've used. And the shapes really remind me of neural pathways, and I like to think of this piece as like an artist's rendition of how my brain might store all of the books that I've read, like overlapping, interconnected, layered, but also sort of jumbled, and some pieces are just forgotten. As my work with books expanded beyond the scale of the book itself, I also began exploring the side of my work made of everyday and mundane materials and turning them into larger sculptures that accumulated multiples. So I shifted in focus from sort of fossilization to accretion. So much of what surrounds us in life are mass-fabricated objects, and it doesn't really seem strange until you see something like 3,000 pencils glued together. And I'm always more attracted to the forms and textures of nature, so I find a satisfaction in taking mass-produced commodities like pencils and other things and introducing them to a more organic organizational mode. What I like about these pieces is that they're sort of inside out because I sand and shape them on the outside of the form. On the outside of the piece, you see the inside of the pencils, and on the interior of the shape, the inside, you see the outside of the pencils, and I like that switch around. There are themes that carry through from installations like prehistorization and archaeologica, such as making man-made objects look like natural specimens. And I call this series Speleothem. Next one, please. And that's like a term for a cave formation, like a stalactite or a stalagmite. And this is just so you see the scale of this piece. And another theme is sort of the dissection of an object. Instead of hardening something in wax and then slicing through it, here I've glued pencils together and then sanded into them. And I seem to be really obsessed with seeing the insides of things. So I think maybe by seeing things from a different perspective spatially, it helps to put them in a different perspective mentally. Okay, so that was a nice look through the development of my work and ideas, and now I want to talk a little bit about how I made the transition from these installations into more into commercial work, I guess you would call it. And so, sorry, I'm losing my place. The first thing I did was take pieces and ideas from graduate school and try to adapt those ideas into forms that made more sense for a gallery setting, because some of the things I was doing were like installations where I'd build a wall and put lighting in and things like that, and that just didn't seem practical at all. So here, this is an example of something that I would put in a museum. These are slices of toilet paper and wax that are mounted to glass, and the idea is that they're like cells on a microscope slide. And I thought, well, that's cool, I love the look of these, but I was awarded a gallery show while I was a graduate student. I thought, well, like, what could I put in a gallery, a small gallery in Tucson, Arizona, that maybe we could sell and start my gallery career. So I decided to do something like this. I did a whole show of pieces that are also made out of toilet paper, and they're still sort of about the idea of like cells. They compact together like the cells in our bodies, and the cardboard tubes kind of act like nuclei in the cells. But this one's also small. It's 16 inches by 16 inches, and it's squared off, and the composition reads like a little abstract art piece almost. A bizarre one, but something you could imagine on a wall in a home, potentially. Sorry, one more. There we go. The story of these pieces is that it was my first gallery show, and I'd been used to doing some pretty wild things in graduate school, so the idea of presenting in a gallery for sale a bunch of pieces made out of toilet paper didn't really strike me as an odd idea until I made all of the work and I gave it to the gallery, and they said, "This is great, we'll hang it up, come to the opening on Friday." And I went home and I had like a minor panic attack because I realized what I'd done. I was like, okay, you just went from your academic setting out into the real world. What is this gonna be like? That was probably a lack of foresight on my part because I didn't think about all the non-grad school people that would be walking downtown and be shopping and stopping into a gallery and looking at work and how they might receive this. In the end, I think it turned out really well because the pieces did have a certain amount of beauty to them. They weren't meant to be like disgusting or gross. And so a lot of people really liked them, but I'm sure an equal number of people did not. So after that show, I went looking for other materials that might not be quite so bizarre, but still would sort of like make sense within what the kind of work that I do and my idea of sort of taking man-made materials. So I started working with a really common building material, PVC pipe. I made like 70 smaller pieces that explored different ways of cutting and combining the pipes. And then when I got to about this size, which is about 6 feet wide, they started to feel a little bit boring to me after all those pieces. So I introduced some more dimensionality into them. And by attaching the pipes to a curving wood like frame backer, they became this wave. And I really liked how it's kind of like pipes transmit, water, and now the piece sort of reflects like ripples and waves. And I also like that it went from something that I would like literally just go into Home Depot, get a bunch of PVC pipes, and then transform them into this like very serene and beautiful art piece. So it's like the idea of transformation, which is like still in the work there. They have like this nice regular shape to them, which makes them like enjoyable to look at. And then they also have this like no pattern to the cuts. So like there's also this little element of like almost chaos to just like all the little detail in there. And I also love about these pieces that they really play with light and shadows, so they can actually change depending on how you light them, or if they're in natural light, like over the day, the sun changes and the piece actually changes, which is really cool. And this is just an example of how far I took that idea. This is a 16-foot long piece that's hanging in the headquarters of Fidelity Investments in Boston. So it like got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I just wanted you guys to see like how I started small and just like progressed through to something. I've already shown you how I translated some of my material experiments with books into those larger wall pieces, but I also wanted to have some smaller bookworks that would also go on the wall, and so I created this series, which is called Interleave. And in this, the books are cut and then wet and interwoven, and pretty much everything I like cut up some books and then I wet them, and then I do something with them. But this like way of sort of interweaving them makes a really beautiful pattern, and it's a process that I can repeat, but they're not like repetitious as pieces. And also, like, one of the benefits of this was that I can easily transport something like these pieces, and they're not as complex and to put up, so it's like a little more practicality. I had to come to practicality. And then to make a piece that sort of had some of the sensibility of the cerebral mapping pieces, I developed a way of intertwining books and mounting them to a backing board and then framing them. And they became quite large, and they have like this really beautiful abstract nature to them and texture to them that you can see, like some of the different colors that emerge from the books when I wax them, which I think is just such a cool part about books. I don't add color to anything, but you can see that there's like light variations in colors, and it's maybe different kinds of paper, maybe different ages of paper, that kind of thing. And I just love how like each of them has visually and in color like a different kind of look to it. You can do the next one. So here's like an example of really close up. The books look so like fluid and organic, and I love how you get little details like this is the little like fabric binding at the top of the book that like that's where the books are all held together. I just love little bits like that. You can still see the structure of the book is still there, but it's all taken apart and combined in this like really cool way. For a long time, even though everything had a sort of sensibility of nature in my work, I really wanted to avoid making pieces that actually mimicked nature, because that felt too much of a one-to-one comparison to me that maybe wasn't as interesting as leaving it a little more open-ended. But eventually I got to the point where I was like, I have to make this piece because it's like the comparison, this direct comparison to wood and the growth rings of a tree, but it's made out of strips of book. And so it's like, I mean, it's not exactly like what a tree cut through, like cross-cut tree looks like, but it really hints at that. And for this one, it seemed to really work because it's like the idea that the paper is made out of wood pulp, and then here it's coming back into something that makes you immediately think of trees. That to me just suggests the life cycle of objects, and how like that's also key in my work, is like taking things that are made from nature but we think of as man-made objects, and then turning them back into something that we think of as natural, and sort of pointing out how everything's just a part of a continuum. There is no man-made or natural. It's like all kind of the same thing if you like go on a long enough time scale. As my work has grown in size and I'm using different materials, I notice a couple of themes that keep just popping up in my work. For instance, this is a very large piece. It's 6 feet by 6 feet, and it's made of plywood that I've glued together and carved. And I found that carving all the way through the wood to create holes where you can see the wall, after I made this piece, I was like, wait, that goes all the way back to the toilet paper work, whereas like those holes in the toilet paper. So it's kind of like sometimes with work you just see yourself reflected in what you make that you didn't necessarily know was there. You can see in this detail how carving through the layers of different types of wood and the dark glue holding it all together makes like a really intriguing pattern. And while in many of my pieces it's like the irregular shape, like the irregular shape of the piece is sort of the visual interest in the piece, it's here that the holes become the activated negative space. Okay, so now I wanted to show you some examples of my work that sort of speak to the creative process and how things sort of like grow and keep growing. you've seen how I went from like the small experiments to the larger, more finished works, but this piece is a good example of how sometimes if you just keep working the same idea, it can keep developing. So that installation is made up of thousands of Q-tips, which we've already seen in the porcelain, but here, instead of firing them in a ceramic material, I've dipped them in plaster, and then like taken these bundles and grouped them on site. So here's a like look at me composing the different like bundles of like on the floor. So that was the first incarnation of this piece. And then the next time I installed it was at Gallery Urbane in Dallas, and the floor space was a little more limited, so I came up with this idea. And here the piece flows down out of the corner and like out into the room, spreading out. And I really liked this, and it felt like that made more sense to me than the way I had originally placed it just on the floor. Like it had it felt more grounded somehow to be like coming out of the corner. So after this installation, I kept thinking about that and like how that had transformed it and how that made more sense. It's literally the same components, but combined in a different way. And then I came up with a new idea for the next time I installed it. And that is this like cascading down from the ceiling and just sort of almost like splashing out into the floor. So this is like a good example of, I never would have initially thought to create this piece at all. I really like it and it feels like a part of my work, but it only came through creating the other iterations of this piece. So it's just sort of like that evolution. This is another example of how you have to try things out and find your way with art. I love this piece, and I'm so glad that I made it, but you can see that it's very different from some of the other pieces I've been showing you. Here's a closer view of it. This is made out of pieces of wood that I've like cut on a saw many, many times and then broken out little pieces and then glued them together and sanded the face of it. So it's like a lot more architectural than organic. It's almost like the flip side of like taking wood and turning it into something geometric or man-made looking. And like the material is just wood, it's not a man-made object, so it's different from the rest of my work in that way. It made me a little uneasy to try it, but there was just something about this process that I had come up with that I really enjoyed, and I also thought the result was pretty interesting, and it also feels kind of like the multiples of objects gathered together in a sort of somewhat maybe chaotic, or maybe there's a pattern there kind of way. So it kind of connected with my work, but it's like on the far periphery of my work in a sense. So it's like something that felt like the very edge of my work, like the very boundary of like if I went any further beyond this, it wouldn't feel like mine anymore, but this was like right on the edge. So doing something like that just helped me in my head to kind of clarify like where the boundaries of my art are. And so it's one of those things that like maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't, but of course it fits, it's mine. But it makes me think about the next piece, like maybe the next piece bringing it back towards something that feels like more central to my work. And then similarly, this is like another kind of, maybe on the other side of the periphery of my work. This is made out of marble, carved marble. I went to Iceland and I saw this place where the glaciers break off into the ocean basically and get kind of like melted in the ocean and battered around in the ocean, and then in a high tide washed back up on this beautiful black pebble beach. And so there's these huge like basically ice sculptures all over this black sand beach, and I went there and I was just like completely floored. My jaw dropped. It was like, these are the most beautiful forms. They had holes in them and like beautiful like ripple marks on them just from like melting, these huge pieces of like glacial ice melting in these cool ways. And it just sort of like broke my heart. It was like, they're all going to be melted in a few hours. You know, like what can I do? So this just inspired me I was like, you know what these need to be? These need to be made in marble. That would be the right like opposite material choice for this form. And so I learned how to carve marble just so that I could make some pieces that sort of reflected that sensibility. So in a sense, it's also like I said, it's kind of on the edge of my work as well. There's no man-made particular part of this other than the fact that I made it, and the fact of the like desire to preserve something from nature and the sort of hopelessness of that. So that was kind of an interesting experience, but it taught me several things, like how to carve marble, and like one of the ways you do that is using an angle grinder, and that just like opened up my whole like mind to later being able to use an angle grinder to carve other things. So that led to my most recent series, which is called Aggregate. And you can see some of those, these are the pieces here. This is that piece, actually. So this series is made out of junk mail, and the process of creating it was another one of those sort of like, it's one of those things where it's like just step by step. I go step by step and see what interests me and what to keep working with. I came up with this technique of using junk mail and basically just like gluing it together until you've got just like a mass, and then treating the face of that block. I came up with that around 2020 as I was looking for new materials, and then we had the pandemic, and it was like you can't go out and source things as easily. And I'd been thinking for many years, like, I've got to be able to do something with all this junk mail that comes into my house every day, and it feels perfect for me, but I have no idea what to do with it, and I was always kind of frustrated with it, because like sometimes it feels like you should be able to do something, but you just can't quite think of the thing. So finally one day I was just like, all right, I gotta try something, and so I just started cutting it up, and I glued a bunch together, and it looked terrible, and I hated it. I was like, okay, well that's enough of that. But then after, I don't know, it was like a week later, and I had been grinding something, and I thought, hey, I bet I could just hit that thing with my grinder and see what happened. And I did that, and all of a sudden I was like, whoa, that's really cool. Actually, now it's neat. Before it was like just like a mess of paper, and now it's like something that has a real beauty to it. So then I started trying out different things. So like this is a version, well, you can see it here. We'll move on. So I started trying, like, I'll gather it all together, and I'll kind of like make this into this almost like layers. Like it's the layers of junk mail, like, or like the linear versions of junk mail, like sort of suggested layers. And I thought, well, what if they could become a little bit more organic? So we'll kind of like spread them out a little bit, or we'll add a little something to it. You can advance one more. There we go, yeah. So we'll kind of like make it a little more organic, and maybe like square off the edges and get a piece this way. And pretty soon it was really clear that there was a geologic influence going on here, because it was like all these layers and lines that keep like lining up. And here we'll go one more, yeah. Like it just felt like folded bits of rock or something like that, or like a whole like mountain pressed together or something like that. It really just felt like layers. And so once I realized that, and I had a think about it, I was like, that is so opposite to junk mail. Like those two things are so opposite. And I didn't intentionally set out to like this is going to be a set of work that is inspired by geology, and I'm going to make it out of something that's incredibly temporary in our lives where we just like toss it in the recycle bin. So we can go ahead one more. But I'm going to like take this idea that is already existing in what the experiments that I'm trying, and I'm going to push it as far as I can, because those two ideas, like that is my work. Those two things mixing together, like that makes sense to me. That is my work. So that's like an instance where sort of the content comes from the like material experimentation that I was doing, and that has happened many times in my work, and is like why I'm such a proponent of like sometimes you just have to make things and see what happens and see what it is, and then be willing to let your original ideas go and follow what is actually presenting, like what the art is actually presenting to you. So for this series, I've just taken it as many different ways as I can with sort of that theme of geology. So some of them look like, I call this fold, because that's just like the geologic term for like folded up layers. And then I've got something that's called fault, which is almost like, you know, like where there's layers and then there's a crack and they fault and they split. And so I just took that to like into the process. You can see this from the side. This is the sort of faulting look to it. And then some of them I decided to start adding plaster to them. So they have this like, it looks like almost like a slab of granite or something like that you're looking at, like with all the swirls in it. And a nice detail of that kind of thing. And then I throw in some color just to make sure you know that it's not an like organic material, that I didn't just like take a slab of rock. They don't look exactly the same, but you know. So, and then like this is my most recent version of this that has sort of the plaster, and I'm calling this slice because it has this like this cool organic edge. It does feel like a slice through rock or a geode or agate or something like that. And here's a nice detail of that. So that's kind of my most recent process, and we'll see where else it goes, but I'm really having fun sort of taking that concept that I discovered and like branching out as much as possible. I just have a few slides here at the end that show this is me forming the books, just so you get a sense of like kind of how those things go together. And a slide of me sanding that with some of those pencil sculptures, and you can see it's a very dirty process. And then this is just like when I glued the junk mail together, how it starts out, you see on the table, it's kind of like a mess until I hit it with the grinder and like really start to smooth it down. And I think that is my talk. I have a website. You can follow me on Instagram, and you can find my work at Gallery Urbane in Dallas. So, thank you.